Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined for a second time by Dr. Émile Torres. They are a researcher at Leibniz Universität Hannover in Germany, and today we're talking about their latest book, Human Extinction, a history of the science and ethics of annihilation. So, Dr. Torres, welcome back to the show. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Okay, so just for people to know, last time in our previous interview, we talked a lot about long-termism, so let's leave that aside today, even though it's one of the topics of your book. But just to start off with, how old is the idea of human extinction? And we have to say, in this particular case, in Western history, because that's what the book is about. I mean, it's certainly the case that before the first Western philosophers, there were already people thinking about human extinction and in other cultures as well. But here we're dealing just with Western thinkers, right?
Yeah, great question. So I think the idea, part of answering the question requires defining the term. So if, there's a minimal definition of human extinction, whereby at one point in time we exist, there are instances of Homo sapiens, and then at some future point there aren't. So that's minimal in the sense that it says nothing about the permanence of our disappearance. There are certain conceptions of human extinction where our disappearance is just temporary. And so that notion, that goes back to the ancient world. Mm-hmm. So there were, a bunch of pre-Socratic philosophers who proposed different cosmological models. And one of them, for example, a guy named Xenophanes, he had this cyclical model whereby the universe oscillates between two different stages. He called them wetness and dryness. And during the stage of dryness, life exists. During the stage of wetness, all life disappears entirely, so including humanity. But by virtue of the fundamental nature of the cosmic order, we always reappear. So this is a kind of minimal sense of human extinction, goes back to Xenophanes. There were others sort of around the time, other pre-Socratic philosophers like Empedocles, who had a similar sort of model, except there were 4 stages. 2 of them we disappear, 2 of them we reappear. And then, maybe the most intriguing case comes from the atomists. So these are, people who believed that atoms are the fundamental constituents of all matter. So interesting, this notion of there existing atoms, that goes back a really long time. Although, back when the ancient Greek atomists were living, there wasn't much evidence for it. So it was sort of a somewhat true belief without much justification. But anyways, part of their view is that the universe is infinite, and there's an infinite number of atoms. And they believe that cosmoi is what they call it, which is basically just what we would think of as like a solar system. Yeah. These cosmoi will collide. There's all sorts of catastrophes that could befall the cosmoi. Inevitably, at some point in the future, they will disappear. And so as a result, our future is, our fate is total annihilation. So that's what they believe. So this also gets it at maybe even a slightly more robust notion of human extinction, because they believe that when our cosmoi is gone, it's gone forever. Mm-hmm. But since the universe is infinite, like a straightforward implication of their theory was that somewhere else in the corridors of infinite time and infinite space, a world exactly like ours would, reappear. So humanity, in a sense, doesn't ultimately go extinct. So, these are, very early notions of human extinction. There are a few other examples. And then, the idea basically then completely vanished, even in the most minimal sense. it became more or less unthinkable for like 1,500 years. And this is the result of the rise of Christianity. But perhaps I'm jumping ahead here.
Yes, you're mentioning that. I was just about to ask you to please give us a view of something that you explore in the book that has to do with 5 periods and 4 shifts across history up to the present day, that perhaps puts into perspective how the way we think about human extinction has evolved through time.
Yeah, excellent. So one of the things that I feel like I discovered rather than invented when I was researching the book is that Western history can be periodized into 5 segments. And they're like very neatly defined. The transition from one period to the other is, in every case, has been very abrupt. And these periods, correspond, each period corresponds to a different set of answers to fundamental questions about whether human extinction is possible, if it is possible, whether it could actually happen in our world. Because it's, it could be the case that, okay, in principle, human extinction is possible, but there just aren't any ways that we could actually go extinct, So that's a separate question. There are further questions about like the etiology, what is the cause of human extinction? Is the cause natural or anthropogenic? How many different extinction scenarios are there would be another question. So these are all questions that could be given different answers. Right. And there are certain configurations, certain sets of answers that define each of these periods. And throughout those periods, the answers to those questions were very stable. There were very few people who had proposed different answers to these fundamental questions about our existential predicament in the universe. And so basically I argue that these periods correspond to what could be called existential mood. And it's a kind of like public mood. It's a mood of the times, because there is this kind of emotive element to how those questions were answered, right? So when people realize that our extinction is possible as well as inevitable, you saw this just explosion of philosophers and scientists who were just kind of just struck by the dismal implications of those answers. And like, well, what is the purpose? What's the point of anything if in the end all will be lost? And so a lot of them just sort of sunk into despair. So the public mood, the existential mood, was one marked by this, kind of sense of cosmic doom. And so anyways, these 5 periods, like the first period, I think the key characteristic was this notion of human indestructibility. We're fundamentally indestructible. And so that extends from the ancient world all the way up until the middle of the 19th century, so the 1850s, really. And this covers the ancient period when some philosophers did think about human extinction, but nonetheless, given their sort of models of the universe, there was a sense in which we are nonetheless indestructible. So yes, we go extinct, but we always reappear. This notion of human indestructibility is compatible with the idea of human extinction. But then, as I mentioned, this idea of indestructibility took on a more radical form with the rise of Christianity. And it's suddenly, even the most minimal sense of human extinction was almost universally, would have been seen as unthinkable, as just an unintelligible impossibility. And I'd be happy to explain that a bit more.
By the way, let me just interrupt you there for a second. When it comes to Christianity, that is also tied to the idea, theologically speaking, of the soul, right? Because the soul cannot go extinct, right?
Exactly, yeah. So, I mean, I argue in the book that with the rise of Christianity, there were 2 clusters of beliefs that rendered this notion of human extinction kind of a naturalistic notion, so that this idea of a universe without us to be an unintelligible impossibility. And so one of these clusters of beliefs has to do with the concept of extinction. It's a general point about the possibility of extinction of anything. And that was the Great Chain of Being. The Great Chain of Being was this model of reality which ordered everything into a linear hierarchy.
Yeah.
And a key aspect of the Great Chain was the notion that none of these chains can go missing. That's just metaphysically impossible. The reason is that there was this idea that the fullness of the universe, the fullness of the chain, the fact that every single type of being that could exist, it does actually exist, is instantiated, and that always remains the case. That was seen as evidence of God's perfection. And so, if a chain were to go missing, that would mean that God's not perfect, but God is perfect. Therefore, no chains can go missing. And so this sounds, it's kind of a weird idea to modern ears, but this was hugely influential from like the 3rd, 4th centuries of the Common Era, all the way up until the very beginning, first few decades of the 19th century, so 1800s. And I mean, it was the backdrop for like most things that philosophers were writing. You see evidence of it everywhere. It's just what people thought. The universe is maximally full, and extinction of any kind is impossible. So the obvious implication is that human extinction is impossible. Yeah. It's metaphysically impossible. It's just the nature of reality disallows it. So that is one cluster of beliefs, and then the other one has to do with, in part, what you had mentioned, this notion that we are endowed with immortal souls. Yeah. And we're embodied souls and ensouled bodies. And if it's the case, humanity just consists of a bunch of individuals. If those individuals are immortal, it follows that humanity itself is immortal. So, and I think this is why this is why I would argue that the concept of human extinction would have struck many people for that 1500-year period when Christianity was dominant as unintelligible. Because the concept of human contains within it the concept of immortality. And so to say humanity can go extinct is to say that an immortal type of thing can undergo a process that only mortal kinds of beings can undergo. And that's just a logical contradiction. It doesn't make any sense. It's not that different from saying, circles can have corners. It's like, no, they can't. By virtue of the nature of circles, they can't have corners. So same thing with humanity. By virtue of the nature of humanity, we cannot go extinct. So that's one idea within the second cluster.
Right.
The other one has to do with the eschatology of Christianity. So that's just like kind of the eschatology is the study of last things. And so the eschatological component of Christianity states that, in the end, there will be the second coming of Christ, the parousia, and depending on your interpretation, will be raptured just before that. But then there's the Battle of Armageddon, millennial kingdom, and ultimately, at the end of time, God will purge, will basically destroy the heavens and the earth, and then remake the heavens and the earth. And so that marks the beginning of eternity. So all of this is to say that we play this central role in this eschatological narrative. It doesn't seem possible for this narrative to unfold without us. We're kind of, we're one of the main characters. And so it's, from this eschatological perspective, then there's sort of another reason why human extinction would have been seen as just unthinkable. It's like, no, God has a grand plan for the entire universe, and we are an integral part of that. Therefore, it just makes no sense that we would disappear. How could the scales of cosmic justice ever be balanced if we just cease to exist? So these are with the rise of Christianity, you had the rise of these two clusters of beliefs. So I call it, there's the Great Chain, there's the ontological thesis, this notion that we're immortal as individuals, and therefore humanity is immortal, and then the eschatological thesis, the notion that we're the main characters in the show, and the show must go on. So therefore, we can't disappear. So you have this, the great chain, ontological thesis, eschatological thesis, those emerged with Christianity and remained central to the Christian worldview for 1,500 years. So early 1800s, the great chain catastrophically collapsed. In part because scientists realized that actually some species have gone extinct. And so, therefore, the traditional notion of the great chain is wrong. And then it was really throughout the 1800s that the other two theses, eschatological, ontological, started to decline with the sort of retreat of religion, especially among the educated classes. And so that opened the conceptual door for people to think for the first time in a very long time that, wow, maybe our extinction is in principle possible, because maybe we aren't immortal. Maybe there isn't some grand plan that we're a key part of. And reality just is such that actually it's the case that species do disappear sometimes. So, I mean, that's a traumatic realization. Like, it's hard to overstate just how significant the psychocultural trauma of that was throughout the 19th century.
Right. Okay. And then, so that's what you call from around the 1850s up to the mid 20th century, the period of existential vulnerability and cosmic doom. But then, 1945, the atomic bomb arrives, and what happens after that?
Yeah, and so it might be worth filling in a few gaps to what I was saying about the 1850s, if that's okay.
No, sure, go ahead.
So it wasn't just the decline of Christianity. That opened the door to thinking it's possible, thinking extinction is possible. But then there's the further question that I mentioned before. Could it actually happen? Is it, is it something, it's something that could actually happen? Is it inevitable? What is the kill mechanism? What's the way that we could actually disappear? And this is where the discovery of the second law of thermodynamics enters the picture in a really huge way. Because at the time, in the mid 19th century, nobody had any plausible means by which humanity could cease to exist. Some sort of gestured at the possibility that people might not procreate, or there were other kind of ideas. Montesquieu in 1721 in his Persian Letters argues that certain social practices are resulting in the decline of the human population, and he extrapolates this into the future and says that we're on track to completely disappear. But none of these ideas were widely accepted. I mean, maybe I should also mention there were some who suggested that comets could impact Earth. So Lord Byron, for example, he argued in the very early 19th century that there actually have been intelligent beings, different than humans, on Earth in the past, and that they were all wiped out by cometary impacts. And so he essentially makes this argument that we need to anticipate the possibility of a large comet slamming into Earth and figure out some sort of way to divert the comet. So he was the first one, I believe, to propose what we would now call a planetary defense system. But this idea of cometary impacts, that was not widely accepted. So the second law changed that. It was the first kill mechanism that scientists, every reputable scientist said, this is a true law. This is the way our universe fundamentally operates. And so basically the second law says that within isolated systems, basically kind of the disorder of those systems will increase over time. The entropy will increase. And so it was immediately recognized, immediately after the second law was discovered, that Earth is going to become increasingly uninhabitable, if not the universe as a whole. If the universe is finite, then the universe itself will eventually become too inhospitable for any life at all to exist. But even if that's not the case, they thought, our sun is going to eventually burn through its fuel. It'll get darker and darker over time. Earth consequently will become increasingly cold. Humans will migrate to the equator and have to live in little snow huts, and eventually will die out because Earth will just get too frigid for us. So this was, you know, a key idea here is that as the idea of human extinction was beginning to appear plausible, you know, this outcome of human extinction was starting to look possible. You have the discovery of the second law, which says not only that our extinction could actually happen, but it will inevitably happen. So this was a double trauma, you know, that left so many people just in a state of, I mean, Bertrand Russell, to quote Bertrand Russell in a famous 1903 article called A Free Man's Worship, he described it as a state of unyielding despair. Because, you know, ultimately, we will lose everything. And even, you know, every trace of our civilization will be erased, obliterated by the dictatorship of entropy. So that's what happened in the 1850s. And so when you look at the historical record, it's astounding how almost nobody's talking about human extinction before the 1850s. After that, there are so many people who are not just talking about it, but fretting about the inevitable annihilation of our species. And so this existential mood this mood of existential vulnerability and cosmic doom, that remained stable all the way up until 1940s, 1950s.
Okay.
Yeah, and so
there's where we get into the previous question I was asking.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I hope I didn't go on for too long about that.
No worries. I'm more worried about your time than about my time.
Okay. And so, you know, you have hints of this third existential mood, the hints of the nature of the second shift in existential moods during the early 20th century, particularly after World War I, because you know that led a lot of people to become very concerned that we're on a path of technological and scientific development that will ultimately yield technical means for exterminating humanity. So they're increasingly, you know, people are nervous, and you know, there's a fair amount of talk about this. But the second law was the only kill mechanism that was widely accepted. And so all of these other claims about how, you know, we're on this technological path towards potentially destroying ourselves, those were really just speculative and hypothetical.
Okay.
That, of course, changes with the invention of nuclear weapons. Yeah. And one of the things I argue in the book is that there's a useful distinction between when an existential mood emerges and when it solidifies. And so this third existential mood, which was marked by a horrifying sense of impending annihilation, self-annihilation, that emerged in 1945. So if you look at the literature, it's more or less what you'd expect. There's a lot of apocalyptic language. There's, you know, people are talking about doomsday, and recognizing that 1945, you know, August 6th, August 9th, after we've dropped 2 atomic bombs, uranium, plutonium bomb on the Japanese archipelago, that marks some kind of like really significant rupture in human history. So, you know, there were some commentators who were saying like, this is, you know, this is as significant as the moment humanity discovered how to create fire. You know, there was that event, and then there was 1945. But almost nobody linked nuclear weapons to human extinction at first. So, I mean, that's that is surprising. Everybody just pictured nuclear weapons, atomic bombs, as just basically bigger hammers that states could use to smash each other to bits.
Right.
That was it. So what changed? Because, you know, fast forward a few decades, lots of people are linking nuclear weapons with human extinction. What changed is that in 1952, the U.S. invented thermonuclear weapons, so hydrogen bombs, and they are just much more powerful. Mm-hmm. That itself was alarming to many people. The doomsday clock ticked forward to 2 minutes before doom, which set the record all the way up until just a few years ago. So people recognize like this is really bad, but there still wasn't a plausible kill mechanism. So maybe U.S. and Soviet Union could just obliterate each other, but I mean life would go on in other parts of the world. What changed was 1945. As I remember, the beginning of March, there was a thermonuclear test in the Marshall Islands. And this was called the Castle Bravo test. And the explosive yield was 2.5 times larger than what was calculated. So this was a big surprise. You can imagine like pushing the button. It's 2.5 times larger. And what happened was that there was a radioactive fallout, which contaminated a huge portion of the ocean. There were, fishermen who were poisoned, Japanese fishermen actually who were poisoned. One of them died. His last words on his deathbed was, I hope I'm the last person to die of a hydrogen bomb. But even more significantly, radioactive particles were detected all around the world. Europe, India, the US, so this is 3,000 miles north of New Zealand. All around the world, people detected from one bomb. And so suddenly, like immediately, people recognized that even a small-scale thermonuclear catastrophe could blanket Earth with enough radioactive particles to potentially cause our extinction. A lot of people might die from just radiation sickness, but even more so, the ionizing radiation from the decay of these radioactive particles, that would change our DNA, including our germline. So those are the genes we pass down to the next generation. That means the next generation could be just a bunch of mutants, and maybe they are going to be incapable of surviving. So there's like a plausible kill mechanism, which is global thermonuclear fallout. And it is astonishing when you look at the literature how everybody's freaking out from 1945 into the 1950s, but basically nobody's talking about human extinction. And in 1954, so many people, leading scientists, Bertrand Russell, human extinction is a topic of discussion all of a sudden. 1954, is the date when everything changed and self-annihilation became plausible to a large number of people. And so that was that's when the existential mood of impending self-annihilation solidified. And then that was just further reinforced by a whole bunch of other developments, all of which concerned anthropogenic self-extinction. So, there was the rise of the modern environmentalist movement, and there were a lot of reputable scientists who genuinely believed that chemical pollutants could basically, by the same mechanism, modifying our germlines, could potentially bring about our extinction. Rachel Carson, in 1962, published *Silent Spring*, and she was explicit that the two threats to human survival, to the survival of humanity itself, are thermonuclear war and the contamination of our environment with these synthetic, insecticides or pesticides. So then this existential mood is just like reinforced. Other scientists, pointed to overpopulation. There was the rise of the neo-Malthusian perspective. So Malthus, talked about how, agriculture, our food, our source of sustenance increases at an arithmetical rate. Human populations increase at a geometrical rate. And so you'll get these divergences which will result in collapse. But he imagined this happening just on kind of localized levels. So, there's certain like societies that will oscillate through these cycles of growth, collapse, and then sort of regrowth. Neo-Malthusianism like a key aspect of it was applying this to the planet itself, to the global human population. So we're not just talking about like, you know, individual groups, individual societies. We're talking about like the all of humanity.
Yeah.
You know, so all of humanity is going to, you know, the global population is increasing at this arithmetical rate, and the result is going to be some sort of, you know, horrendous global scale catastrophe caused by famines and so on. And some definitely link this with the possibility of human extinction. So there's suddenly just this proliferation of a multiplicity of kill mechanisms, all of which are anthropogenic. Mm-hmm. And it's just very striking. Like second half of the 20th century, you know, people just starting from 1954. Oh my gosh! Yeah. It's so. I mean, it's just it's hard to overstate how traumatic some of these realizations were. So that gets us to the third existential mood.
And so that's mostly about possible anthropogenic causes of human extinction. But what about non-anthropogenic causes? Because if I understand it correctly, then from the 1980s onward up till the late 90s, early 2000s, there were other causes that people worried about that were more natural, right?
Exactly, yeah. So a lot of people are surprised to discover that throughout most of the Cold War, almost the entire Cold War, the majority of scientists, well, I should say for most of the Cold War, the scientific consensus is that asteroids, comets, volcanoes, and so all of these other natural phenomena, they do not pose threats to humanity. Yeah. So basically, what happened was, you know, up until the early 1800s, so sort of going back a little ways just for a moment, people did not accept, overall, people did not accept that species extinctions are possible.
Okay.
Then a guy named George Cuvier proved that actually some species have gone extinct. Okay, so that's shocking. And it led then, you know, naturalists and you know, early biologists, early evolutionists like Charles Darwin, to acknowledge that, okay, so the fossil record is full of all of these species that no longer exist. But there was another problem, which is that if you look at the fossil record, it seems to be the case that there are moments throughout biological history when large numbers of species died out all at once. So that looks like global catastrophes. I mean, global catastrophes is the most obvious explanation for that. A global catastrophe happened, maybe an asteroid or a comet, you know, struck Earth, and then a whole bunch of species died out at the exact same time. But basically, nobody accepted that. Nobody thought that global catastrophes could happen naturally. And the overwhelming majority of people did not accept that mass extinctions could happen. So the reason they held this view is because of a paradigm within the earth sciences called uniformitarianism. And this was initially proposed by a guy named James Hutton back in the late 18th century, but it didn't become a dominant paradigm until George Lyell. And so he published a book in 1830 which defended the uniformitarian paradigm, and it was a very convincing book. It actually, a lot of the arguments were quite bad, but people at the time found it really convincing. And so by the 1850s, uniformitarianism was absolutely dominant. That remained the case all the way up until the early 1990s. And so throughout that entire period, pretty much everybody said, okay, yeah, natural catastrophes can happen, but they're always localized affairs. They're never global. And they certainly don't result in mass extinctions. How did they explain the fossil record? Well, they said that the fossil record is just really incomplete. Fossilization is a very rare process. And so it's just not reliable. So, you know, even though it's screaming that mass extinctions have happened, which implies some kind of global catastrophe, we shouldn't listen. And So yeah, it's amazing that this is what scientists thought all the way through like most of the 20th century. And then 1980, there was a group of scientists led by a father-son team, Lewis and Walter Alvarez. And 1980, they published this article that argued that the appearance of a mass extinction 66 million years ago, although they, I think, said 65, where the dinosaurs disappeared, that was in fact a mass extinction, and it was caused by a large asteroid striking Earth. And they had some like pretty good evidence for this. So if you look back in 66 million years ago, you find a very thin layer of iridium. And that's a chemical that is iron loving. So most iridium on Earth has sunk to the core because that's where the iron is.
Yeah.
But it's very abundant in asteroids. So they thought, I bet an asteroid struck Earth, and probably what it would have done is then kick up a whole bunch of dust into the stratosphere. And the stratosphere there's the troposphere and the stratosphere, and all of the weather happens in the troposphere. So one mechanism of removing aerosols, dust, etc., is through the weather. But if you're in the stratosphere, that mechanism doesn't operate because the weather doesn't reach that high. So the only mechanism for removing dust or aerosols from the stratosphere is gravity, and that is much slower. So the asteroid hit Earth, this is what they hypothesized, threw up a whole bunch of dust. It spread around the globe within the stratosphere and blotted out sunlight. If there's no sunlight, then there's no photosynthesis, food chains start to collapse. Which organisms are going to be most affected by that? Well, the huge organisms, the dinosaurs. So that's how they died out. And so this hypothesis was super controversial, and paleontologists in particular widely rejected it. And in fact, were insulted that these people, physicists and chemists, were like impinging upon their field and telling them that actually mass extinctions have happened, and they were the result, or at least this one instance, it was the result of a large asteroid hitting Earth. And the paleontologists weren't being completely unreasonable, because there was some good evidence for the Alvarez hypothesis, but they were missing the smoking gun. If there is a huge asteroid that struck Earth, then surely there'd be a massive crater somewhere on Earth. And even if it struck the ocean, you'd still find some sort of evidence there. And they calculated at the time that I think about 20% of the ocean floor had been subducted. So just like pushed under another layer, and then you lose all that evidence. So maybe it struck in one of those areas that since, over the past 66 million years has been subducted, but, the probability is still on the side of we should be able to find this impactor, this impact crater. And so it was 1990 when a graduate student rediscovered something that a private company, maybe not a private company, Pemex, had discovered back in like the 1970s or something, but never made a public announcement about this. He discovered that at the Yucatan Peninsula, under the ground, there is evidence of an enormous crater. And the crater dated back to 66 million years ago. And so that was just an amazing discovery. He published this in 1991. And again, so this new existential mood, which is characterized by the sense that actually nature could kill us at any time. That sort of emerged in 1980 with the Alvarez hypothesis, but didn't solidify until 1991. And with the publication of the discovery of this, called the Chicxulub crater, it's amazing. Pretty much every scientist around the world said, yes, mass extinctions do happen, natural global catastrophes do in fact happen, and indeed they have in the past. And so that was just an amazing, frightening realization, because we thought before that we live on a very safe planet in a very safe universe. Yes, entropy will kill us, but that's millions and billions of years in the future. Nature does not pose any threats, tomorrow or next week. And so immediately with the publication of this discovery of the crater, you see a whole bunch of people talking about if it happened in the past, it could happen in the future.
Yeah.
Maybe an asteroid could strike Earth, next year. And if that's the case, then civilization will collapse. Maybe we'll even go extinct. So that was the fourth existential mood. And a lot of the first mood was replaced by the second one, because those are incompatible. Humanity is indestructible. No, actually, we're existentially vulnerable.
Yeah.
But since then, these moods have just like a palimpsest. They've just been layered on top of each other. So this new existential mood, it didn't negate this notion that like human self-extinction is possible as a result of nuclear weapons or environmental degradation, but it just added to this. Like, oh gosh, the threat environment is just getting more and more complex. So it's another trauma.
Yeah. So before we get into the current mood, let me just say that, at least when we thought that only we ourselves could cause our own extinction, I guess that at least people could think, okay, so it's bad, but at least we can like gather all people around the globe and put up a big party and decide on a date to wipe ourselves out. At least we will have some control over it. But if it's natural causes, we're basically doomed.
Yeah, well, it might be possible to devise some kind of planetary defense system. Lord Byron's proposal was a non-starter. He talked about just like figuring out ways to catapult huge, basically mountains at the flaming mass, as he referred to it, in order to destroy it. But maybe there are other ways. Obviously there was the movies. Was it Deep Impact, I think, and Armageddon, which came out, I believe, in 1998, which talked about like maybe using nuclear weapons to explode the incoming asteroid. Although that probably wouldn't help that much. That would just spread the debris over a bunch.
Yeah, the debris would eventually hit Earth and probably spread the damage across the entire globe.
Yeah. But maybe there is a way to just redirect the asteroid, just sort of nudge it to the side. But that being said, it also in the late 1980s, following the Alvarez hypothesis, some volcanologists and geologists proposed that actually there could be volcanic supereruptions. This was a new idea. Maybe there's a volcano that's just orders of magnitude larger than some of the volcanoes that we've experienced over the past few centuries. Yeah. And as a result, it's the ejecta, the gases and so on are so hot that they're, by convection, that they're thrown into the stratosphere. And once you've got debris up there, again, same mechanism, spreads around the globe, blocks out the incoming sunlight. And the reason I mention this is that while there is a kind of plausible way to redirect an asteroid, thereby avoiding that kind of secular apocalyptic scenario, we don't have any good thoughts about how to prevent a volcanic supereruption from destroying us. No good ideas. So, NASA actually was discussing this a few years ago, and they suggested that maybe there's a way to sort of like pump kind of cool water down to the magma chamber. But they said that there's also the possibility that could trigger an eruption. So even science fiction has never come up with a half plausible means of neutralizing that threat.
Okay, so, and what about the present day? Apart from all of the things that we've been talking about that have been piling up on top of each other since around the 1850s, what are some of the more recent worries, let's say?
Yeah. So I argue in the book that the late 1990s, early 2000s is when the most recent existential mood emerged. So humanity is indestructible. Actually, no, we're existentially vulnerable and cosmically we're doomed. Then there was this notion of impending self-annihilation. Thermonuclear war could happen any day. And then it was the realization, oh my God, nature is out to kill us. So you might wonder, like, well, what sort of new realizations could occur to trigger another shift in existential mood? In this case, it wasn't the discovery of any new kill mechanisms. It was really two things that drove the shift of the new existential mood that emerged in the very early 2000s. One was further research on climate change and biodiversity loss. And the other was what I call a futurological pivot, or the futurological pivot, which was a shift in focus from just the existing threats facing humanity to the various emerging and anticipated future threats of the 21st century. Those are the two triggering factors. And so, a lot of people are surprised to discover that there really wasn't a consensus on climate change until about 2001. So there was a lot of debate, 1970s, there was some debate among climatologists who were saying that, maybe the low altitude aerosols are actually going to deflect incoming solar radiation and Earth will actually cool as a result. That was rejected fairly quickly. But, throughout the 1970s, there was this article published in Science in 1979 that discussed the worst case outcomes of global warming. And they described them as gloomsday, not doomsday. So even then it was just like, well, I don't know, things might, Earth systems might be perturbed in some way. Maybe that's bad, but not catastrophic. Same kind of through the 1980s. James Hansen gave his famous testimony before the US Senate in 1988, which raised the public profile of climate change quite a bit. But I mean, even he was criticized by a lot of colleagues for being hyperbolic, And so that continues sort of through the 1990s, this notion that climate change could be catastrophic, that it's really happening, and that it's anthropogenic. A consensus was emerging. And by the early 2000s, that consensus was established. That was a point where, like, basically every legit scientist was saying, yeah, climate change is anthropogenic, and it's going to be bad. Yeah. And then it was, Al Gore's, I mean, just as a matter of fact, it was Al Gore's, I think it was 2004 documentary.
2007, I guess.
Maybe that was the case, but I think it was a little bit before that. But
no, look, I'm not sure. So
I might be wrong. So people should double check. Yeah. I think it was 2004, 2006. But anyways, that sort of really catapulted this issue into the public consciousness. And since then, all of the research has just confirmed that we are in a catastrophic situation, facing like horrendous wildfires, extreme weather events, mega droughts, sea level rise, nations are going to disappear. Just the pillars of modern technological civilization are going to be chipped away at in a completely unprecedented way. And, and the decisions we're making now will affect Earth for the next 10,000 years, a longer period of time than civilization has so far existed.
But about that, is there anyone out there that actually argues or thinks that climate change could lead to actual human extinction? Or it's more the idea that, for example, we will have much worse natural disasters and political and society upheaval and perhaps millions of people dying, but not actually going extinct?
It's an absolutely great question. So I think, if you rummage around in the literature from activists, there is some discussion of human extinction. I think a lot of the climatologists don't think that's the case. There's a small probability that we could trigger a runaway greenhouse effect. But there's a lot of uncertainty, and uncertainty here should not make one feel comfortable or good.
Right.
But there's a lot of uncertainty. But so far as we could tell, that the probability is very low. So if that were to happen, then Earth would turn into just a cauldron, that's completely unlivable. Basically, it's what happened on Venus. There was a runaway greenhouse effect, although the greenhouse gas was water vapor rather than carbon dioxide. But ultimately, same, so the temperatures on Venus are something like 800 degrees on the surface. So maybe that could happen on Earth, in which case, of course, we would die out. But you're totally right. So I see climate change as more of just a contributor to a general sense that the 21st century will be more perilous than the 21st century will be more perilous than the 20th century.
Yeah.
And the 20th century was very perilous, I mean,
to say the very least.
yeah, and I mean, my own view is that if you rewound the tape of history back to like 1950, I think you'd need to run it once for there to be some kind of thermonuclear catastrophe, because there were so many near misses. People don't realize this. There's so many near misses. I mean, I lived in North Carolina for a long time. Just down the road from where I lived, there is a nuclear weapon underground. It fell out of a B-52 bomber and was never recovered. There were 2 bombs that fell out. One was found. They never found the other one. And that one that was found, I believe it went through, if I remember correctly, 7 of the 8 stages that it needs to go through to detonate. So, if that had happened, like, this was in maybe the 1960s, I kind of want to say, but I might be wrong about that decade. But if it happened then, it could very well have triggered, many other examples like that are just spooky and creepy and eerie and very unsettling. So point is, the 20th century was super perilous. 21st century would be even more so due to climate change. But I think there's also this notion that, climate change could be a major contributor to other scenarios that could quite possibly bring about our extinction. So I think just this notion of extinction is just, it's just, it's bound up with climate change and just these prognostications about it being catastrophic in all sorts of complicated ways. So I think that was sort of one of the triggers to this new existential mood, which is marked by an ominous feeling that the worst is yet to come. And the second part was the futurological pivot, and sort of thinking seriously about the technologies that we are developing right now, but are not yet mature, and the technologies that we could potentially develop in the 21st century. That was the other major trigger. And human extinction is very explicitly linked to these technologies, in contrast to climate change, where it's just kind of like there in the same sort of realm.
Right.
So, the technologies of interest are, some futurists like Ray Kurzweil describes these as GNR technologies. So genetics, nanotechnology, and robotics. Robotics is kind of a weird term there, but it's meant to subsume artificial intelligence, including artificial superintelligence.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, there were mentions throughout the second half of the 20th century of these technologies. Some of the first people to worry about AI, were writing in the 1960s, like I.J. Good said, first ultra-intelligent machine that we create will probably be the last invention that we ever invent. And the outcome, he argued, would either be complete annihilation or utopia. But that idea, that was bandied about by a few futurists and then some transhumanists in the 1990s. But it really was like in the 2000s that this idea gained some kind of traction, especially over the past, I think, 10 years. So that was one of the technologies. Same thing with nanotechnology. There were people in the 1980s who, were discussing it and warning that actually it could potentially usher in a kind of quasi-utopian era of radical abundance. But also, maybe there are ways to design nanobots, so billionth of a meter in size, that self-replicate. And maybe what the way they self-replicate is, if they're released into the environment, they grab a hold of organic matter and then use that matter to create clones of themselves. And if that happens, then you get this exponential process of self-replication, and maybe the entire biosphere then is completely destroyed. And so that's called the gray goo scenario. But this also, like, I mean, it inspired a lot of science fiction novels after it was introduced in 1986 by Eric Drexler. But it was, I think, really over the past, like in the late 1990s and 2000s, that like a lot of people who were instrumental in this futurological pivot started to take seriously. And so same with genetics. Like maybe there's the possibility of, you know, using CRISPR-Cas9 or something like that to synthesize designer pathogens that could initiate an engineered pandemic that, you know, sweeps around the entire globe. And, you know, synthetic biology sort of opens up the door to just unnaturally dangerous germs. So like there's you know, some have argued that there's an inverse relationship between transmissibility and lethality. Because if a germ is going to kill its host like immediately, that doesn't give it much opportunity to be transmitted to the next host. So you have this, but synthetic biology could break this inverse relation down. And so maybe, you know, some have suggested that perhaps you could, at least in theory, you could synthesize a pathogen that combines the lethality of rabies, the incurability of Ebola, the contagiousness of the common cold, and the incubation period of HIV. So maybe, you know, it spreads around the globe, but people are completely asymptomatic for 10 years. So that gives it plenty of time to, and then suddenly people are showing up at the emergency room with some, you know, horrendous disease. Maybe you could synthesize a pathogen like this.
And so also, in this particular case, I would imagine that if the pathogen would be unnatural, there potentially wouldn't be anyone out there with a natural immune system that would be able to fight back against it, because we wouldn't have evolved, anyone wouldn't have evolved an immune system that would be able to deal with something like that, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So, you know, these advanced technologies, I mean, I'm personally convinced that these advanced technologies that will introduce unprecedented hazards, you know, and maybe there could be kind of synergistic effects in terms of the catastrophic potential of these technologies by virtue of the interaction. You know, AI might make it easier to synthesize a designer pathogen. In fact, there was a study out just within the last year, if I remember correctly, where some AI researchers thought, you know, we're using this AI system to try to develop medicines, to develop pharmaceuticals. But I wonder what would happen if we asked it to develop a toxin. And so the system, it invented new toxins, some of which, when they were studied, would be as or maybe more dangerous than VX, the nerve agent, which is like the most, I mean, it just takes a tiny amount to kill you. And so they're just like, they you know, published this article just as a warning. Like these systems could enable maybe a lone wolf or a terrorist group or something to design, you know, nerve agents that are just, we've never seen before and are, you know, extremely lethal. So you could say the same thing with respect to synthetic biology and designer pathogens and so on. So this is all part of the futurological pivot. Like these technologies, you know, synthetic biology didn't exist 50 years ago. It does now, and it's only going to be developed further. Advanced nanotechnology doesn't exist now, but like it seems possible in theory that we create the molecular, atomically precise nanotechnology, thereby perhaps making it possible to create self-replicating nanobots.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you know, there's AI. And so, This is the other half. In addition to climate change, there's these emerging technologies and anticipated future technologies that triggered the futurological pivot. And when people, before people were just sort of looking at the threat environment more or less synchronically. What are the existing threats? What's facing us right now? We've got thermonuclear weapons, and maybe they're asteroids, and so on. Then people started to say, actually, let's extend the threat environment into the future, throughout the 21st century, and maybe beyond that.
Yeah.
And when one does that, the threat environment suddenly appears to be this dense obstacle course. There aren't just obstacles right in front of us, but behind those obstacles, there is just a forest of dangers lurking. Yeah. And so that's when people started to think like, oh my gosh, getting through this century is going to be, really difficult. And so you have, people like Martin Rees, who in his 2003 book, which very much embodied this new existential mood, and he was focused on climate change, environmental degradation, but also these emerging technologies. He argued that civilization has a 50-50 chance of making it through the century. There were a whole bunch of others who said, human extinction, is maybe 20% likely just this century. That is, just by comparison, that is orders of magnitude, many orders of magnitude higher than the probability of human extinction in any past century before like 1950. So before that, maybe the likelihood of human extinction was something like 0.0000001%. Mm-hmm. I'm sort of making that, but yeah, it's very, very small.
Sure.
These days, a lot of people say that it's 20%. Yeah, plenty of others. In the book, I list a large number of scientists and philosophers and so on who, some of whom haven't given this impression of mathematical exactitude. They don't give actual percentages, but they affirm that this is, to quote Stephen Hawking, the most dangerous moment in the development of humanity. Noam Chomsky, says the likelihood of human extinction is greater this century than ever before. And those are just two examples. They're, and I tend to agree with, in general, with their sort of dire assessment.
Yeah.
So that is the nature of this new existential mood. And I suspect that when people read that chapter and sort of reflect on their own sense of how dangerous this century is, and then they read the news and they look at the news about AI and climate change and so on, they go, oh yeah, actually this is a distinct existential mood than the ones you had in the 20th century and before.
Okay, so I'm not sure if we will have enough time to touch on existential ethics, but since in our previous conversation we ended up talking a lot about long-termism, at least we touched on a few of the questions that people in existential ethics consider. And so let me ask you one more question about what we've been talking about. So we've been talking about human extinction, but even the term human and extinction, even those terms might mean many different things for different people, right? Because just one thing that was coming to my mind about the term human is, what does it mean exactly? Because, I mean, if we accept evolutionary theory, I guess it's 100% inevitable that eventually Homo sapiens will evolve into another species or a few other species. And so that being the case, if that happens, will that also be human extinction? If at a certain point Homo sapiens just evolves into other species and Homo sapiens itself ceases existing? And I mean, this opens a big can of worms, right? Just thinking about what the term human here means.
Yeah, exactly. So one could argue that our extinction is not inevitable because of Darwinian evolution, because we could use advanced genetic engineering to fix our genome, to prevent it from natural selection and genetic drift and random mutations, so on. Prevent those from but that's a weird idea. I mean, maybe it's possible, but but you're totally right. I mean, human has many different definitions. So does extinction. This topic of chapter 7. So if you ask like an anthropologist, they'll say human means our genus Homo. So that includes Homo habilis, the first human, back 2.6 million years ago. Last I checked. There's a whole bunch of human species: Homo heidelbergensis,
Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo neanderthalensis. Yeah, all of them.
Yeah, exactly. And so all of them are human. I think the most intuitive definition is Homo sapiens, this particular species.
Yes.
But if you ask a futurist, a lot of them use the word human to include our descendants. Even if our descendants are like a different species, or have wildly different properties. Maybe they're even not biological in nature. Maybe they're cyborgs, or they're completely artificial in their physical constitution. And so, there are additional definitions as well. Some futurists, some existential ethicists, long-termists, and so on, will add further kind of normative criteria. So it's any descendant we have, independent of its physical nature, et cetera, so long as it has a certain kind of moral status, equivalent or greater moral status than we have. So a whole bunch of different ways to define humanity. Maybe the most expansive definition comes from a long-termist who defines it as Earth-originating intelligent life. So maybe like our lineage, evolutionary lineage, disappears, but there's some separate lineage that arises that is it originated on Earth and it's as intelligent, quote unquote, as us, then humanity would still exist.
So in that particular case, it would be more a matter of psychological traits than really some essentialist, speciesist view of humanity, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And so and then there are many different types of extinction. I mean, you gestured at one a moment ago, which could be called phyletic extinction. Yeah. That's where Homo sapiens disappears because we evolve into something else, or maybe into multiple post-human species. So that's one way that we could possibly disappear. In that case, our lineage would persist. There'd be some kind of spatio-temporal continuity in our lineage, but our particular species would no longer be around. So, in the book, I identify 6 types of extinction, 6 extinction scenarios that I argue all have their own unique ethical and evaluative implications, right? So, phyletic extinction, some people would not want us to undergo phyletic extinction because, they value Homo sapiens. So they want, our particular species to stick around for as long as possible. There are, transhumanists who would say if Homo sapiens were to undergo phyletic extinction by evolving into some kind of quote unquote superior species of post-humans, that would be great. That kind of extinction would be fantastic.
But that's the other thing, right? Because if we are talking about transhumanism, supposedly also because you're adding the prefix trans there, wherever kind of people we would have after that would not be human, neither.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So the terminology is confusing. Yeah. So on the one hand, the transhumanists would say if we become this radically enhanced species in the future that's different than our current species, let's call them post-humans. Yeah. But many of them would also accept these definitions of human as any descendants we have, so long as they are sufficiently intelligent, quote unquote, or have a certain moral status and so on. So you could have a future population of beings that is simultaneously post-human and human. So it's the terminology is just not good. Maybe we need new words. Maybe we need new concepts. This is just an understudied area. And so it's not surprising that there's like pretty basic confusion about, we don't really have good conceptual categories or ontological categories for making sense of the space of future possibilities. And in a non-confusing, problematic way designating some future population as post-human without saying they're human, or vice versa or something. So yeah, so phyletic extinction is one of the types of extinction. There's also demographic extinction, which I think is the most intuitive notion, which is just where the human population, however you define human, dwindles until no one exists.
Yep.
That can happen very quickly in like a global catastrophe. It could happen, very slowly. Maybe there's an infertility scenario that results in humanity fading out over the course of several centuries. Theoretically, demographic extinction could happen instant. If there's a physics disaster at the Large Hadron Collider, which seems very, very improbable, but if it did happen, it could destroy Earth at virtually the speed of light. So that's another way demographic extinction could happen. The terminal extinction adds a condition of permanence. So it's not just that we disappear, but that we disappear forever. And so I think they're ethical, futurological, and historical reasons for making this distinction. I'll just mention the historical reason real fast, going all the way back to Xenophanes and Empedocles and the Stoics as well. They believed that we would undergo demographic extinction in the future. In fact, we will undergo demographic extinction an infinite number of times in the future. We have undergone demographic extinction infinite number of times in the past, but we will never undergo terminal extinction. So they accepted demographic extinction, sort of this minimal notion of human extinction, but rejected terminal extinction. And that is precisely why the idea of the fundamental indestructibility of humanity is compatible with their understanding of the prospects of human extinction. So that's demographic, terminal, phyletic, and then there's final extinction, which is just this idea that we die out without leaving behind any successors.
Yeah. And
so that is yet another criterion, because we could undergo terminal extinction, but have successors. Maybe they're post-human successors. Maybe they're, we bequeath the world to intelligent machines, which is something that a number of futurists have passionately advocated for. We should do that. And so the idea with the distinction between terminal and final extinction is that what happens after our species disappears could make a huge difference to how one evaluates the extinction event. So if we undergo terminal extinction, we disappear forever, but we avoid final extinction. Civilization continues, our values are carried on by this future population. Maybe that's not so bad. Or some others would argue, no, that would be very bad. Maybe what matters is that we exist, or maybe what matters is the elimination of suffering, and so we should try to bring about extinction. What kind of extinction? Final extinction, because that's the only way you could guarantee that there are no more beings like us that will suffer. And so we've got four types of extinction. The fifth one is normative extinction, and this just has to do with those normative definitions of humanity. So maybe it's the case that we have descendants in the future, and they replace us, but they lack a certain moral status. Maybe they lack the capacity for consciousness. And a lot of philosophers would say if there's no, maybe they're intelligent, they're still like doing art and conducting scientific experiments and so on, but there's no consciousness, there's no inner qualitative mental life. And so as a result, they would, we basically would have bequeathed the universe to rocks, at least with respect to their phenomenological, experiences. And so that's the idea of normative extinction. There are future beings, but they lack something that's normatively important for them to count as human. And that is enough to satisfy the minimal definition of human extinction. There are no more instances of human beings or humanity in the universe. And so that's the fifth notion, and then the sixth one is just premature extinction. That's this idea that the timing of extinction matters. So maybe if we undergo final extinction, after some event of importance happens, that would be very bad. But if we undergo final extinction before some event of importance happens, that would be much worse. So what is that event? Well, maybe it's like flooding the universe with astronomical amounts of value. Maybe it's the construction of a complete scientific theory. That's what some people value. Maybe it'd be just a huge shame if we're here for a bit. We, looked around at the universe. We were utterly puzzled. We marveled at it. we felt a sort of terror of not knowing why there's something rather than nothing, and then we just disappear. And so that would be a real shame. It'd be much better if we had an answer to these fundamental questions before we disappear. That's the notion of premature extinction. So you're totally right. I've written before that, when somebody asks you a question like, would human extinction be bad? The first thing you should do is say, well, what do you mean by human?
Yeah.
And what do you mean by extinction? Do you mean phyletic extinction? Do you mean terminal or final or, Got to disambiguate that question.
Yeah, do we still have time for just one final, hopefully quick question?
Yeah.
So, because as I said, as I mentioned last time, we've already talked about some of the things that people value about humanity, again, wherever that means, and that we would lose if we went extinct somewhere in the future. But what about people who look at things in the opposite way? So, I mean, when it comes to people who don't care much about humans going extinct or not, I mean, someone could say perhaps they are a nihilist and they just say, oh, come on, human life or life in general doesn't have an intrinsic value, so who cares if we go extinct or whatever? Or someone might say, oh, I don't care too much about we going extinct. I just care about people who exist having a good life or having a happy life or something like that. But I mean, are there many people, in this case, particularly philosophers, who actually argue for human extinction? I mean, it's not just that they don't really care about humans going extinct or not, but they advocate for human extinction and actually think that perhaps it would be better for us to go extinct?
Yes, definitely. So I classify them as pro-extinctionists.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important here. That's one of three main positions within existential ethics. Their equivalence views and the further loss views, like utilitarianism and long-termism.
Yeah.
Pro-extinctionists, to understand their position, I think it's really important to distinguish between the process or event of going extinct and the state or condition of being extinct. So further loss theorists would say, like, going extinct, that could be really bad. Maybe it's a catastrophe, lots of people die, they suffer, that's awful. But being extinct also is a source of badness because there's this opportunity cost, there's all this lost value, future scientific developments, future happiness, and so on. That is morally and evaluatively relevant as well. Equivalence theorists just deny that and say, no, being extinct doesn't matter. There's nobody around to be harmed by the non-existence of humanity. So how is that a bad state? Going extinct may be terrible, but being extinct is not bad. So that's equivalence views. And then pro-extinctionists, I think the heart of their view is that being extinct is better than being extant or continuing to exist. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't mean that being extinct is good, right? Being extinct could still be really bad, but being extant, continuing to exist, could be worse. I know some people who hold this view, that being extinct would be just absolutely awful. Okay, well, then do you think we should try to continue surviving? No, because I think survival is worse. So the reason I mention this is a key idea is that, there have been many pro-extinctionists throughout Western history. The overwhelming majority of them would say that going extinct in most scenarios would be absolutely awful. And we should avoid a catastrophe that brings about our extinction, because that's going to cause a lot of suffering and a lot of death. And both of those things are very bad. And so, yes, many of these individuals have not just argued that being extinct is better, but they've made the further claim that we should strive to bring about the state of being extinct. And so then there is the obvious question, how do we do that? What is the menu of options for getting from where we are right now, being extant, to where we want to be, being extinct? And there are really three main possibilities. One is omnicide. That's the murder of everyone. And again, the overwhelming majority of pro-extinctionists have said omnicide is profoundly immoral. I don't want to argue this.
Just a second. But in this case, what they're arguing is for someone to kill everybody else, including themselves, or for people to simply accept that this would be better and for them to off themselves?
Great question. Yeah, excellent. So omnicide is where one or more people kill everyone.
Okay.
And so, the omnicide became possible with the invention of thermonuclear weapons, right? Or in the early 1950s when there was the arms race, and there were enough thermonuclear weapons to potentially kill everyone. So omnicide is a new phenomenon, and that is what they would say is deeply immoral. Another option on the menu is promortalism, and that is where everybody takes their own life. And so those are different, right? Because you've got agency when it comes to...
Yeah, that's why I asked the question, because I would imagine that from an ethical perspective, people would evaluate in very different ways someone killing themselves or someone killing other people.
Totally, right? Yeah, killing someone else is that's just obviously immoral. Violation of autonomy and rights.
Sure.
And, but taking your own life, I mean, there are different views about that. Some people obviously are going to argue that that's immoral. Many other people are going to say that it's not. But either way, there are very few pro-extinctionists who have advocated for promortalism. There's just a few examples. I mean, there was one in the late 19th century named a German pessimist philosopher named Philip Mainlander, and it has an absolutely tragic story. I mean, both of his siblings also committed suicide, and he wrote this big book, his memoir.
And then he also committed suicide, right?
Yeah.
Hanging on the rope, and I think he used his own book to... He stood on his own book to commit suicide, if I remember correctly.
I believe it was the day after he got the first copies of his forthcoming book.
That rings true. That rings true.
Yeah. So but Mainlander is a bit of an exception because the overwhelming majority of pro-extinctionists have said antinatalism is the only acceptable route, and that's where people just without coercion, without any kind of without coercion, voluntarily decide to not have children, to not replace themselves. And so then you get the human population dwindling over, the next 100 years or so until nobody exists. And so that, many pro-extinctionists have said that is the only morally acceptable route. So we want to get from being extant to being extinct. How do we do that? Well, we just need to decide not to have children. And so there are many pro-extinctionists who have embraced antinatalism. Peter Wessel Zapp is an example. A more recent philosopher, South African philosopher named David Benatar, has defended this position. So but you're absolutely right that right now, the further loss view of long-termism, that's sort of like really caught on and is enjoying a moment in the spotlight. With like a lot of people who are advocating for it. But historically, further loss views were not that widely adopted. I mean, there are very few philosophers who even ever discussed this issue. But among those who did, it was, a lot of people who thought that it would be better if we, stop existing. And then a bunch of others in the, middle of the 20th century who held more or less my view, the equivalence view, that going extinct would be really bad. And for that reason, we should avoid our extinction. But if everybody decided not to have children, would that be bad? No. Who would it hurt? Who would it harm? There's these hypothetical future people who are unborn and forever remain unborn. Well, you can't hurt them because they don't exist. So, and the loss of things like science and the arts and so on, if there's nobody around to suffer those losses, then do those losses really count morally? And so, a lot of people would argue no. And so, one might get the wrong impression that these further loss views like long-termism, that those have been the most popular. No, that's a very recent development.
Right.
Pro-extinction has been very influential from the latter 19th century with the German pessimists, even through the 20th century.
Yeah. Okay. So, Dr. Torres, I'm getting really mindful of your time now. So, just to mention the book again, Human Extinction, A History of the Science and Ethics of Annihilation. I'm leaving a link to it in the description box of the interview. And would you like just to mention, apart from the book, where people can find your work on the internet?
Yeah, sure. So my website is xriskology, so as in the study of risk, xriskology.com, and that's also my handle on Twitter. For some reason, I'm still on Twitter. So, yeah.
Okay, great. So, look, thank you again for taking the time to come on the show. It's always a pleasure to have you on, and I really loved the book. So, I hope that everyone who listens or watches this interview runs and buys it because it's amazing.
Thanks so much for having me. It once again was an absolute pleasure to chat with you.
Hi, guys. Thank you so much for watching the interview until the end. Please share it, leave a like, comment, and hit the subscription button. And if you like what I'm doing and to keep the channel sustainable, please consider supporting it on Patreon or PayPal. Even just $1 per month is already a great help. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Perga Larsen, Jerry Muller, Hans Fredrik Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Castle, Matthew Whittingburg, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Eric Alenius, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel Andreev, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cusson, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonio Correa, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostaszewski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, Simon Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Panos Cortez, Ursula Litske, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolosin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Moray, Alex Shaw, Amari Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Errington, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Zigor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zuel, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dobner, Luke Neeson, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandin, Nicholas Carlson, Ismael Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowleys, Kate Von Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, and Perpendicular. A special thanks to my producers, Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanegdam, Bernard Hugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Al Nick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Adriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Vega G. Thank you for all.